revelations today that former Vice President Cheney was personally involved in briefings with senior congressional leaders aimed at defending enhanced interrogation techniques. Our fourth story on the countdown. The curious sidebar here. The briefings were in 2005, 3 years after the techniques were introduced. Kind of like telling Congress you're going to use atomic bombs against the Japanese, telling them in 1948. Mr. Cheney attended at least 4 classified CIA briefings with senior congressional leaders beginning in the winter of 2005, according to the Washington Post. The Cheney meetings coincided with a key period during which Congress was considering the Detainee Treatment Act, barring the use of cruel and inhuman interrogation methods, as if they hadn't already been barred. And congressional leaders were also threatening to investigate or even scrap techniques like waterboarding. Cheney's name was left out of CIA documents sent to Capitol Hill last month, detailing 40 of those classified meetings. But Republican Senator Lindsey Graham describes the former vice president's involvement this way, quote, "His office was ground zero. It was his office you dealt with at the end of the day." Cheney's attempts to sway Congress went even further. In July of 2005, he sent his chief counsel, David Addington, to Guantanamo Bay with 5 senators, including 4 opposed to the interrogation methods. That would be the same David Addington who in 1987, along with Mr. Cheney, authored the House Intelligence Minority Report that said the president could basically break the law when defending the nation. When Senator Graham, a military lawyer, questioned relying on executive orders and secret Justice Department rulings, Addington waved a copy of the Constitution at Graham and said, "I've got all the authority I need right here." Let's bring in the Washington editor of The Nation magazine, Chris Hayes. Good evening, Chris.
Good evening, Keith.
I think the question here isn't why Cheney. Isn't it why 2005?
Yeah, well, I mean, the timing, I think, was motivated entirely by the wrestling match, frankly, that was going on Capitol Hill. I mean, we had this strange thing happen in which these policies were implemented kind of under cover of darkness. We don't know really the full amount of briefing that went on to the legislative branches in, say, 2002 and 2003. 2004, we had a campaign in which none of this was mentioned because John Kerry was terrified to make this a campaign issue. And then it exploded in 2005, and we finally, largely because you had John McCain and Lindsey Graham on the Republican side questioning the nature of the policy that had been put in place, you had a kind of rebellion on Capitol Hill. I think these briefings, they weren't informational briefings. They were essentially intergovernmental lobbying opportunities that Dick Cheney was taking on.
Underlining the point, they certainly weren't political, in any event, not directly so. They were not in the vein of a White House congressional liaison. They were classified, right. The kind of thing that the director of the CIA at that point, Mr. Hayden, would lead sometimes. Were they done in part so they could also say later, oh, no, we briefed everybody?
Well, I think there's part of that. I mean, I think that the earlier briefings, I think that was largely the case. The one that, you know, we know on the warrantless wiretapping, the briefings they did where they read in, say, Senator Jay Rockefeller, and he had to write a letter saying, I'm really not so cool with this because it was classified, he couldn't say anything. So part of the briefing was that. But in this specific moment, I think this was a weird kind of conflation of some sort of official intelligence briefing in which ostensibly you're having sort of civil servants and government bureaucrats read in members of Congress on the details, and essentially a kind of political power play by Cheney to make sure that Congress didn't sort of cut off the authority that he thought that resided in the executive branch. So it's a weird kind of blurring of roles to have the CIA career officer sitting there in the room and, you know, lurking over his shoulder is Dick Cheney kind of nodding in the background.
Did we learn anything more today about exactly when some lawmakers would have known that waterboarding specifically had been used?
Well, unfortunately, we didn't, because the briefings that are sort of at issue are briefings that happened earlier. So we know there were briefings earlier that, as far as we know, Dick Cheney wasn't involved in those, although, you know, we're getting new revelations all the time. So maybe he was there as well. But as far as we currently know, we know, A, there were briefings. We know Dick Cheney, or we think we know that Dick Cheney wasn't in there. They were given by the CIA. And we just don't know the substance of what happened in that room. That's where the kind of, you know, conflicting accounts regarding the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, have been. But on this specific revelation, today's Washington Post, it doesn't move the ball any further in terms of what actually was discussed in those meetings.
Does it move the ball further on trying to identify whether Cheney was again in these things, trying to operate on this line of, as long as the president does it, that means it's legal?
Yeah, and more than that, I mean, that clearly is what they thought, and that's what Addington thought. They had this absolutely insane conception of executive authority. But even more than that, it shows just how, I mean, it's a really sort of bizarre kind of situation in which you have the vice president going over to kind of to fight tooth and nail to keep what is essentially his kind of pet program. I mean, more and more we're seeing the continuity is that this really was Dick Cheney's jihad.
Extraordinary.